The world never saw it coming. The story of nations is often written in the shadows. Whispered meetings behind closed doors, letters slipped across borders in silence, and promises made with the weight of history pressing down on every word. But few could have imagined that a young captain from one of the poorest nations on earth would one day shake the foundation of global power with nothing but conviction, defiance, and a secret too dangerous for the world to accept. It began with an ultimatum. Markets trembled as oil cartels, embassies, and international financiers whispered the same question. What is Burkina Faso planning? Rumors rippled through the halls of Washington, London, and Brussels. Satellites tracked unusual movements in West Africa. Indian planes landing in Ouagadougou at night. Convoys escorted by masked soldiers. Strange geological equipment humming in the desert. Something was happening. Something the world wasn't supposed to know. Burkina Faso, a country mocked for its poverty, dismissed for its lack of power, and ignored in every boardroom of global energy. Yet suddenly, whispers grew louder. Crude oil, vast reserves buried beneath the soil, long hidden, long denied. For decades, maps declared the land dry, worthless, and barren. But what if those maps had been lies? What if the earth beneath Burkina Faso carried not just oil, but the possibility of rewriting Africa's destiny? At the center of this storm stood Ibrahim Traoré, young, resolute, carrying the weight of millions on his shoulders. To some, he was a rebel leader clinging to an impossible dream. To others, he was the heir to Thomas Sankara, the man who dared to imagine an Africa free from foreign chains. But unlike his predecessors, Traoré held something different: leverage. The one resource the modern world could not ignore. In the dim light of his office, documents lay spread before him. Seismic surveys, old French colonial archives, handwritten notes from miners who had long since disappeared. All pointed to the same truth. Burkina Faso was sitting on untapped wealth. Not gold this time, not cotton, not uranium stolen under the cloak of development contracts. No, this was bigger. This was oil, black gold. And whoever controlled, it could no longer be ignored. But the discovery came with a price. Even before the truth emerged, foreign agents began to circle. Western corporations sent emissaries cloaked in the language of partnership. IMF representatives arrived with new demands for debt repayment. French officials tightened their grip, reminding Traoré that Burkina Faso's destiny was interlinked with Europe's. And in the desert, strange accidents began, pipelines exploding before they were even built, survey equipment mysteriously sabotaged, workers disappearing in the night. Still, Traoré did not stop. What the world dismissed as a fool's dream, he began to forge into reality. But he could not do it alone. If Burkina Faso was to rise, it needed a partner strong enough to resist the storms that were coming. That partner was India. For India, energy was more than economics. It was survival. A nation of over 1 billion people racing toward modernity, desperate to secure its fuel for the future. For years, New Delhi had struggled under the pressure of oil cartels dominated by the West and the Middle East. But here, hidden in the heart of Africa, lay a chance at something no one expected. A direct alliance, outside Western control, built not on charity, but on strength. The first meeting was not public. No cameras, no flags, no signatures, only shadows. Indian envoys arrived in Ouagadougou under the cover of darkness, escorted by armored vehicles through streets where electricity flickered and markets lay empty from hunger. They entered the palace quietly, greeted not by fanfare, but by silence. Silence heavy with the knowledge that every step was being watched by enemies. Inside, maps were unrolled, data exchanged, voices hushed. The Indian diplomats listened carefully as Traoré laid out his vision, a $75 billion oil breakthrough that would link Africa to Asia, bypassing the chokehold of Western powers. He spoke not of contracts, but of liberation. Not of profit, but of sovereignty. For India, it was audacious. For Africa, it was unprecedented. For the world, it was dangerous. If such a deal succeeded, it would set fire to centuries of economic control. It would mean that Africa no longer needed to beg. Would mean that Asia no longer needed to kneel. It would mean the balance of power was shifting, quietly, steadily, right under the eyes of those who thought themselves untouchable. But the risks were clear. Already intelligence reports whispered of foreign spies infiltrating the talks. Already, mysterious deaths shadowed those who supported the project. Already, Burkina Faso's fragile economy was being strangled by sudden sanctions. Food shipments delayed, fuel reserves blocked, loans frozen overnight. A message sent, "Do not dare." Yet Traoré stood unmoved. When the world expected him to bend, he tightened his grip. When others would have bowed, he rose taller. Behind his young eyes burned something older than politics, a fire forged in the hunger of his people, in the legacy of Sankara, in the soil of a nation tired of being told it was nothing, and so the stage was set. Africa, forgotten and dismissed, stood on the brink of rewriting its story. India, long underestimated, prepared to join hands across continents. Together, they were about to sign a pact, not just of oil, but of destiny. The whispers grew louder. Boardrooms trembled. Cartels panicked. Because what Ibrahim Traoré carried in his hands was not merely a contract, not merely a resource. It was the possibility of a new world. And what he did next shocked them all. The silence that followed the first meeting was deafening. No one beyond the walls of Ouagadougou's palace knew what had been promised, yet the ripples of that night reached oceans away. In Washington, analysts marked unusual flight paths between West Africa and South Asia. In Paris, advisors whispered about the madness of Traoré. In London, a memo circulated with a single warning stamped in red. If this deal succeeds, Africa will never be the same. The weight of those words soon manifested in the lives of ordinary people. The suffering of the people Burkina Faso was already bleeding. In the north, villages went dark. Fuel was scarce, electricity scarcer. Mothers carried empty containers to markets, only to return with nothing but dust. Children cried from hunger as aid shipments, delayed by unseen, hands sat in foreign harbors. Farmers, once proud of their crops, now found their goods rotting in silence because international banks had frozen trade credit. It was a slow strangulation. The message from abroad was unmistakable: surrender or starve. But amid despair, whispers spread like sparks. They spoke of a hidden treasure beneath the soil, of a leader who had dared to look beyond borders, of a deal with a giant from the east. It was hope cloaked in rumor, fragile but dangerous enough to ignite belief. This shadow of resistance, yet hope was not without enemies. On the ground, Western corporations accelerated their campaign. "There is no oil," their reports declared. "Burkina Faso is chasing a mirage." Their media allies echoed the same lines: a reckless gamble, an unstable leader, a resource poor, land grasping at shadows. And yet, behind closed doors, those same corporations dispatched teams of operatives to sabotage survey sites. Trucks carrying seismic data mysteriously overturned. Computers with critical mapping files vanished in the night. A drilling rig caught fire under suspicious circumstances, flames swallowing months of effort. In Ouagadougou, Traoré's advisors argued among themselves. Some, terrified by the pressure, began to waver. A few secretly passed information to foreign embassies, hoping for protection should the dream collapse. The betrayal was silent but deadly, like cracks in a dam before the flood. The Indian gamble. Meanwhile, in New Delhi, debates raged in the halls of power. Should India risk everything for a deal with a landlocked African nation, already under sanctions, already drowning in foreign hostility? Some ministers warned of catastrophe. "The West will crush us," they said. "We cannot fight two wars at once, one in Asia and one in Africa." But others saw more clearly. They spoke of history, how India, once colonized, had broken its chains, and how now it had the chance to help another continent do the same. For them, this was more than oil. It was an act of defiance. And so, quietly, India prepared. Engineers drafted blueprints for joint refineries. Economists modeled trade routes linking West Africa to Indian ports. A small circle of diplomats, sworn to secrecy, began crafting a pact that could bind two continents. But secrecy had its limits. The more India leaned toward Traoré, the more the world leaned against him. Sanctions and shadows. First came the economic blows. International banks refused to clear Burkina Faso's transactions. Fuel imports collapsed. Inflation spiraled. Farmers traded grain for candles. Teachers abandoned classrooms to work in black. Markets, doctors struggled with empty shelves in clinics. Then came the political isolation. Regional bodies, pressured by foreign powers, suspended cooperation. Leaders who once called Traoré a brother now refused his calls, fearful of the consequences. Burkina Faso stood alone, surrounded by suspicion, targeted by propaganda, and yet the young captain pressed forward. He gathered his people not with promises of wealth, but with words of survival. If we cannot breathe under their chains, then we must learn to breathe without them. Still, the shadows grew darker. The mystery of Sankara's papers, it was in the archives of an old government building, long forgotten, where a discovery added fuel to the fire. Buried beneath decades of dust, an aide uncovered a locked chest marked with the seal of Thomas Sankara, the revolutionary leader assassinated in 1987. Inside were papers, notes, and maps, documents suggesting that Sankara had known of hidden oil reserves long before the world dismissed them. Among the writings were cryptic references to the blood of the earth and the key to Africa's independence. For Traoré, it was more than coincidence. It was destiny, a sign that he was walking a path his predecessor had glimpsed but never lived to see fulfilled. The revelation spread in whispers across the capital. To some it was myth, to others, prophecy. But to Traoré it was proof that history had handed him a torch, and he could not let it fall. Betrayal within, yet even destiny could not silence betrayal. One evening, a convoy carrying seismic data to the presidential compound was ambushed. The attackers knew exactly when and where the trucks would be. The files were stolen, the guards slaughtered. Within hours, copies of the data appeared in foreign hands. Traoré summoned his advisors, demanding answers. But the betrayal was faceless. No one confessed. No one stood guilty. He knew then that enemies sat not only across oceans, but within his own circle. Every handshake, every nod of agreement carried the possibility of treachery. Still, the work continued. The people rise as hardships grew unbearable. The people of Burkina Faso began to change. They marched through the streets not in protest, but in defiance. Farmers gathered in dusty squares, chanting for sovereignty. Students painted walls with slogans of resistance. Mothers carried portraits of Sankara and Traoré side by side, whispering to their children that freedom was worth hunger. The struggle was no longer just about oil. It was about dignity. And though the world tried to suffocate them, the people refused to bow. The final preparation. By late summer, preparations for the deal reached a breaking point. India and Burkina Faso agreed to sign the accord publicly, in New Delhi, under the eyes of the world. For Traoré, it was the riskiest step yet. Traveling beyond Africa meant exposing himself to enemies everywhere. Assassins could strike. Diplomats could corner him. Armies could threaten him. But he knew there was no turning back. The journey would either seal his nation's future or bury it forever. On the eve of his departure, he walked alone through the palace halls, past portraits of past leaders who had fallen before foreign powers. He paused before Sankara's image, lit by a single candle, and whispered words only he could hear. The next morning, a plane lifted from Ouagadougou's tarmac, carrying with it not just a man, but the weight of a continent's hope. The world watched. Markets quivered. Enemies sharpened their knives, and as Traoré's plane crossed the skies toward India, one question haunted every capital on earth. Would he return with victory, or not at all? As Traoré's plane pierced through the haze above the Indian capital, millions of eyes were already turned toward him. For weeks, the world's media had speculated, gossiped, and condemned. Headlines screamed of a reckless gamble and a dangerous alliance. Some claimed the trip was a farce, that Traoré would never dare step foot on Indian soil. Others insisted he would not leave alive. But there he was, standing firm, stepping down the aircraft stairs in his military uniform, his red beret a flare of defiance against the grey sky. Cameras flashed, broadcasting the moment across continents. For some, it was the arrival of a hero. For others, it was the provocation of a threat. the atmosphere of suspense. The streets of New Delhi brimmed with tension. Posters of the upcoming summit plastered walls. Thousands of protesters paid by foreign lobbyists shouted in anger, "No deal with dictators!" Nearby, supporters, African students, Indian workers, ordinary dreamers, carried banners, proclaiming solidarity. Africa plus Asia. Future. Security was suffocating. Snipers watched from rooftops, helicopters circled overhead, and plainclothes agents melted into the crowd. Rumors of assassination plots swirled through the air like smoke. A single bullet, a single explosion, could end everything before it began. Inside the Indian parliament, the atmosphere was no less tense. Diplomats argued furiously behind closed doors. American envoys warned of serious consequences. European officials threatened trade retaliation. Oil corporations sent veiled ultimatums. If India signs this deal, the West will remember. And yet, behind those walls, India's Prime Minister prepared to meet Traoré, not as a supplicant, but as a partner. Shadows in the hotel. The night before the signing, Traoré and his delegation stayed in a heavily guarded hotel on the edge of the capital. The building was a fortress, every window sealed, every hallway patrolled, yet unease seeped through the walls. At 2 a.m., alarms blared. An intruder had been caught trying to breach the compound. A man carrying a silenced weapon, a forged ID badge, and instructions written in a foreign language. He was captured before he could act, but the message was clear. Traoré was a marked man. Sleep was scarce that night. In his suite, Traoré sat by the window, staring into the darkness. He knew the risk. He knew he was walking into history unshielded, but he also knew something greater. If he faltered now, Africa would sink deeper into silence. He whispered to himself, "Better to fall standing than to live kneeling." The day of reckoning dawn broke with a weight unlike any other. Convoys of black cars rolled through the city, carrying leaders, diplomats, and the burden of a continent's future. The grand hall prepared for the signing ceremony glistened under golden chandeliers. Flags of India and Burkina Faso stood side by side, a sight that shook the world before a single word was spoken. Journalists packed the room, cameras flashing. Every lens aimed at the young captain who dared to rewrite history. Financial markets across the globe froze, waiting. Oil prices twitched nervously, traders glued to their screens. Traoré entered the hall, flanked by Indian officials, his expression carved from stone. Every step echoed like thunder. Every breath was history written in motion. The confrontation. Before pen could meet paper, the storm struck. American envoys, their faces sharp with fury, approached the Indian delegation. In hushed but urgent tones, they issued a warning. "If you sign this deal, your ties with the West will suffer. Think carefully." The Europeans followed with threats of sanctions, boycotts, isolation. Even within the Indian parliament, last-minute dissent flared. Some ministers demanded delay, others feared catastrophe. The hall buzzed with chaos. Reporters scribbled, cameras zoomed in, whispers spread. The deal is collapsing, and yet, in the center of it all, Traoré remained motionless. He did not shout. He did not plead. He stood tall, his silence louder than all the voices around him. Slowly, deliberately, he reached for the pen. The attempt. Then came the gasp. A figure broke through the crowd, sprinting toward the stage. Security lunged, too late. A hand rose, with a concealed weapon, its barrel glinting under the chandeliers. The hall erupted in screams, bodies scattering, flashes of panic exploding like gunfire. But fate twisted. The weapon jammed. In an instant, guards swarmed the assailant, dragging him to the ground. The cameras caught every second. The sweat on his brow, the veins in his hand, the fury in his eyes. The world watched in shock. And Ibrahim Traoré did not flinch. Without a word, he lowered himself into the chair, lifted the pen again, and pressed it to the paper. The signing silence blanketed the hall. Every sound, the scratching of the pen, the breath of the crowd, the hum of the lights, became thunderous. With each stroke of ink, the balance of power shifted. With each letter signed, centuries of dominance cracked. Finally, the paper, was sealed. Ibrahim Traoré leaned back, his name carved beside India's. The deal was done. $75 billion, oil, independence, defiance. The hall exploded in a storm of cheers and rage, of celebration and fury. Some clapped, some cursed, some wept, but no one could deny it. History had just been written. The aftershock within hours, headlines raced across the globe. Traoré signs historic $75 billion oil deal with India. Africa and Asia unite against the West. Markets in chaos as oil giants panic. In Wall Street, traders shouted as prices swung wildly. In Paris, politicians seethed. In Washington, strategy rooms lit up through the night. But in Ouagadougou, thousands poured into the streets, chanting Traoré's name, waving flags, singing of freedom they had never tasted. For them, it was not just about oil. It was proof that their nation mattered, that their voice could no longer be silenced. The signing was complete. The world was shaken. But this was only the beginning. Because if one small African nation could stand against centuries of control, what stopped the rest of the continent from rising too? The ink was barely dry when the tremors began. In that single moment, a pen pressed to paper, a treaty sealed, the old order cracked. The grand chandeliers of New Delhi's hall still glittered, the cameras still clicked, but across the world, the aftershocks rippled, like earthquakes. The world in panic in New York, Wall Street erupted. Screens flashed red as oil futures swung wildly, traders shouting into phones, some losing fortunes in minutes. In Paris, ministers slammed fists onto tables, demanding retaliation at once. In London, advisors muttered of containment, strategies, while in Washington, the White House Situation Room buzzed like a hornet's nest. How could this happen? One official barked. A map of Africa glowed on the wall, arrows pointing toward Burkina Faso. Not long ago, the country was a footnote. Now it had rewritten the script of global power. Retaliation. The response was swift. Sanctions tightened overnight. Ships bound for West Africa were rerouted. Aid programs suddenly suspended. Loans withdrawn. International corporations froze contracts, citing instability. It was economic warfare dressed in the language of diplomacy. But this time, Burkina Faso was not alone. India, bound by the ink of the treaty, dispatched its first shipments of technical equipment. Engineers landed in Ouagadougou, their presence a shield against isolation. For the first time, Burkina Faso could look outward and see an ally standing, firm. Yet enemies did not sleep. Sabotage spread. Pipelines under construction mysteriously collapsed. Explosions rocked storage depots at night. Reports of armed rebels, supplied with foreign weapons, increased near drilling sites. The battlefield was no longer hidden. It was everywhere. The streets of Ouagadougou back home, the streets of Burkina Faso, became rivers of people. Tens of thousands marched, carrying flags of both nations, chanting Africa plus Asia. The young and the old alike filled squares, believing for the first time that their suffering meant something more than despair. Yet in those same streets, others plotted. Foreign agents blended into crowds, spreading rumors. The oil is a lie. India will betray us. Traoré has sold the country. Pamphlets, written in foreign tongues, were left in markets to divide the people. But unity, fragile as glass, held firm. The hunger was still real, the struggle still bitter. Yet hope gave the people strength they had never known. India, under pressure. Meanwhile, India faced its own storm. The West turned its gaze toward New Delhi with threats veiled in diplomacy. Trade sanctions were hinted, investment deals stalled, ambassadors pressed for explanations. Why Burkina Faso? They demanded. Why risk everything for a nation so small, so unstable? But for India, the answer was simple. Because the future was no longer written by size, but by courage. Because the partnership was not about oil alone, but about shattering chains that had bound continents for centuries. And in every Indian newsroom, in every African cafe, the same question surfaced. If India and Burkina Faso could defy the world together, who else might follow? Whispers of conspiracy, but power never changes hands without blood. As Traoré returned from India, whispers followed him. Plans of assassination circulated once more. His motorcade, they said, was targeted by snipers hidden in the desert. His aircraft, they warned, might never reach home. He traveled under a cloak of secrecy, his movements hidden, his routes unknown even to his closest allies. The paranoia was suffocating, but necessary. For every mile he flew, enemies waited with sharpened knives, and yet he returned, alive, unbroken, carrying the weight of victory. The symbol in Ouagadougou, his arrival was more than a homecoming. It was an eruption. Crowds gathered in such numbers that streets overflowed, voices rising in a roar that shook the city. Women wept openly, men lifted children onto their shoulders, chanting his name as if it were a prayer. Traoré raised no grand speeches. He stood on the balcony, silent for minutes, watching the people. His silence spoke louder than any words. We did it. That night, bonfires burned across villages. Drums echoed through the savannah. The poorest of the poor sang of oil, not because they had seen it, but because they had seen the possibility of dignity. The storm beyond Africa, but the world beyond Africa was far from celebration. At an emergency summit in Brussels, European leaders debated military options. Naval deployments to West Africa were proposed. Intelligence agencies drafted covert missions. The deal must be broken, they whispered. In Washington, economic advisors warned that global oil dominance was cracking. If Africa began selling directly to Asia, bypassing Western firms, the very foundation of power would shift. And in secret boardrooms of oil giants, executives raised glasses of whiskey not in victory but in dread. They knew the truth. The age of monopoly was ending, betrayal within, again. But perhaps the greatest danger was not outside, but within. Some of Traoré's ministers, once loyal, began to waver under the pressure of wealth. Tempted by offers from foreign agents, they whispered of delaying the deal's implementation, of renegotiating terms to appease the West. Files leaked, sabotage continued, delays mounted. The question loomed. Would betrayal within prove deadlier than any enemy abroad? The moment of fire. Then came the explosion. In the northern desert, a newly constructed depot meant to store the first barrels of crude erupted into flames. Fireballs lit the sky, black smoke choking villages for miles. Official reports called it an accident. Traoré knew better. Standing over the wreckage days later, he clenched his fists. The cost of defiance was fire. The price of freedom was blood. But his resolve did not falter. If anything, the flames hardened his will. We will rebuild, he said, again and again, until they understand that Africa does not kneel. The rising tide, despite sabotage, despite sanctions, despite betrayal, the tide began to turn. Engineers from India and Burkina Faso worked side by side, drilling deeper, moving faster, securing reserves untouched for centuries. Oil, real, tangible, undeniable, began to flow. Tankers prepared for their first voyage east. Contracts expanded to other sectors: trade, technology, agriculture. The deal grew larger than oil. It became a bridge. Across Africa, leaders watched, some in silence, others with envy, but many with a spark of courage awakening in their eyes. If Burkina Faso could defy the storm, why not them? The climax was not a single moment, not a single signature. It was the storm unleashed. Retaliation, sabotage, fire, betrayal, and the decision to rise anyway. The world had thrown everything at Ibrahim Traoré. And still, he stood. But what came next would decide whether this was a fleeting flame or the beginning of a fire that could never be extinguished. The storm had burned. And yet, after the fire and sabotage, after sanctions and betrayal, after assassination attempts and endless threats, something remarkable remained. Hope. Not the fragile hope of speeches, not the hollow hope of foreign aid, but a hope written in barrels of oil, in contracts signed, in ships prepared to sail east. A hope backed by action. The first voyage, the day the first tanker left West African shores, the world froze. Painted in bold letters across its side was a single phrase: Burkina Faso, India. From the harbors of Lagos to the ports of Mumbai, from Paris to Washington, every camera turned to that ship. For many, it was just steel and fuel. For others, it was revolution made visible. Crowds lined the coastline as the tanker pushed forward. Women ululated, Men raised fists. Children ran barefoot across sand dunes, chasing the sight as if chasing destiny itself. The IMF cracks in Washington, inside the marble halls of the IMF, panic brewed. For decades, African nations had crawled through its doors, begging for loans tied to crushing conditions. Now Burkina Faso showed another path, resources for partnership, not debt for slavery. A leaked memo spread like wildfire. If more African nations follow Burkina Faso's model, our leverage collapses. For the first time, the IMF, a towering giant of financial domination, trembled. The ripple effect, one by one, African leaders began to shift. Ghana quietly opened talks with India. Mali's ministers sent delegations to Beijing. Even oil-rich Nigeria, long tied to Western companies, began considering alternatives. It was no longer about Burkina Faso alone. It was about the idea that the small could rise, that the ignored could lead, that Africa could trade without kneeling, and the more the West pushed back, the more unity grew. The people's reward, for the people of Burkina Faso, the effects were not instant miracles. The soil did not suddenly yield food, the skies did not rain gold, but change was visible. Roads once abandoned were paved with new machinery. Schools reopened with books supplied by Indian partners. Clinics received shipments of medicine long denied. For the first time in memory, children in villages spoke not of leaving for Europe, but of staying, of building, of having a future at home. The oil was wealth, yes, but the true treasure was dignity. Traoré's speech to the World Weeks. Later, Ibrahim Traoré stood before the African Union in Addis Ababa. His uniform was simple, his red beret unmistakable. Cameras broadcast his words to every corner of the globe. He did not boast of billions. He did not taunt his enemies. Instead, he spoke of unity. We are not poor. We were made poor. We are not weak. We were divided. Today, Africa writes a new chapter, not by permission, but by will. If they sanction us, let them. If they sabotage us, let them. We will rise, not once, not twice, but forever. Because Africa belongs to Africans. The room erupted. Some leaders clapped politely, others rose to their feet. But in the hearts of millions watching, a fire was lit. India's gamble pays. Off for India too, the gamble bore fruit. Oil shipments stabilized fuel prices, insulating its economy from Western manipulations. Technology transfers with Africa boosted its global influence. The nation that had once been seen as a follower now emerged as a leader of a new, non-aligned front. Western analysts called it reckless. Asian thinkers called it visionary. But the truth was undeniable. India had chosen courage over convenience, and won. The broken chains in villages across Burkina Faso, elders told stories by firelight. But this time, the stories were not of slavery, of colonization, of endless loss. They told stories of resistance, of the day their nation stood tall. Children listened with wide eyes, knowing they were part of history itself. No longer would Africa's narrative be written only by outsiders. The silent enemies, of course, not all battles were over. Foreign agents still lurked, Western corporations still plotted, some African elites still dreamed of returning to their former masters for personal gain. But something fundamental had shifted. Fear was gone. And once a people lose their fear, no empire can ever fully control them again. A world rebalanced. Across the globe, think tanks debated the Burkina Faso effect. Economists redrew charts. Politicians rephrased speeches. The world order had not collapsed, but it had cracked. And the cracks were spreading. For decades, Africa was treated as a pawn on a global chessboard. Now, a pawn had reached the other side and transformed. The final lesson, and the sun set on Ouagadougou one evening. Ibrahim Traoré walked through the streets with no fanfare, no guards, just a soldier among his people. Children ran up to him, pulling at his uniform, smiling. He bent down, speaking softly. "This is for you." And in that moment, the billions, the deals, the politics, all of it faded. What remained was simple. A nation once forgotten, now remembered itself. The final lesson was clear. Racism destroys families. Prejudice weakens communities. Greed divides nations. But courage, unity, and dignity rebuild what centuries tried to break. Africa's story was not over. It was only beginning. Moral takeaway empires rise and fall, but the human spirit endures. When dignity replaces fear, when unity shatters division, even the smallest nation can make history.